We are getting into material that has to do with the actual personages that we call judges. My ambition today is to get through 3 of them, and even though that may seem to be ambitious, believe it or not, from the text, it actually isn't. Because as I said sometime in the last couple of weeks or so, some of the judges, there's barely anything said about. Some of the judges, their stories, their narratives are a little more stretched out and have a little more to them. The 3 that we endeavor to look at tonight are 3 short ones. And so hopefully we'll be able to accomplish this. Now, where we're starting at is right there at the bottom of this slide. This is just, by way of reaching back to last week. What had happened, we had this cycle expressed to us in chapter 2 where the Israelites, they depart from following after God. They turn to false gods. They get into a situation where God's wrath and indignation is expressed to them and upon them. And then they cry to the Lord, and the Lord hears their cry and sends them a deliverer, a savior, a judge, and who's able to, with God's blessing, is able to deliver them from whatever source of agony that they're having, and then they are able to have some peace. Now, all of that is necessary because they did not follow through on Joshua, the commands that were given Joshua about conquest. And so after Joshua disappeared from the scenes, the Israelites found themselves always surrounded by enemies. They were living with them. They were living in the midst of them. So, God said, if you leave them alone and don't follow through by faith in getting rid of them, they're going to end up being a pain in your side. You're going to end up being tempted to follow after their gods. You're going to depart from the Lord, and then you're going to be in trouble. That's exactly what happened. So that's really what the bottom of this slide is kind of about. When they heard the news from the angel of the Lord that came, from Gilgal to pronounce this, I guess we could say it's the curse of the cycle of judges upon them, it made them sad, and they started crying, and oh, please no, we'll be better the next time. How it is. All of their crocodile tears did not convince God, not in the least. And so, hence the book of Judges. And there's the nations, the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Sidonians, the Hivites, the Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, and Jebusites, all listed. There's the verses for there. That's all in Judges, starting with verse number 20 in chapter 2, and it goes down through to verse number 6 in chapter 3. And that is that story, which brings us to the first instance of Judges. And so this is where we're going to start with reading tonight, and I'll start reading here. There we go. Verse number 7, chapter 3. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God, and they served the Baals and the Asherahs. Now, we'll pause it for just a second in the reading, just for a little footnote there. The Baals that you see there, plural. Baal singular means Lord. When it says Baals plural, that's referring to the fact that virtually every town had their own take on this false god Baal. And so there was a Baal of Peor, and there was a Baal of Sidon, and there was a Baal of this and a Baal of that. And they were all somewhat different because it was, they were so focused locally in the area where that was. So when it says Baals, that's why it does that. It's not, Baal is not a substitute for the word God. Sometimes Lord can be that, but it's referring to the master of that area, the spiritual master of that area, basically. And so that's why that's plural. And then when you see the Asherahs, you'll see that, like you see up there, it says Asheroth. You'll see that word sometimes used as the translation for it. That one's actually more accurate in this particular text, in this particular spot. but the Asherahs are basically the same thing. Asheroth is a mother goddess. So very similar in some ways to the Catholics' take on Mary. But the mother goddess was a fertility goddess, not necessarily in the same way that you would have, like something like Aphrodite, but not all that similar. Something like it, but not all that similar. So all of those pagan gods in the Levant and in Egypt and in Greece, even the Norse gods to some extent, not as much, but if you go from the Indus Valley down by India, the whole way over to the Nile and then up into Greece, it's like the paganism in that area was nothing but begged, borrowed, and stolen, because they just kind of all had similar mythologies with similar stories, similar gods. They didn't have the same names. It's like the names were protected, or the names were not, or changed to protect the guilty. That's the way it was in there. So that's what those are, and so that's what Israel was worshiping. The people that were there worshiped those gods. Israel did not keep themselves segregated from them and did not endeavor by faith to see them pushed out, and as a result, they ended up bound down to their gods and intermingling and intermarrying with them, and this was evil in the sight of God, and he had anger. Verse number 8: the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. I think whenever you see those kinds of names, you should just make up your own name and place. It'll work. As long as it's consistent, it's just fine. So the Israelites were subject for 8 years, but when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him, so that the land had peace for 40 years, until Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. And so there's that brief story of, this is all that's said of him. So, this is the entirety of the story. There are the major points. Cushan, it was of Aram. There is some debate amongst the scholars trying to locate exactly where he's from. You'll see that in some texts it just simply defines where he's coming from as Mesopotamia. The word that's used there doesn't necessarily mean Mesopotamia as we would reckon it today. Like if you remember your geology classes in school way back when, and you looked at Mesopotamia, you were looking at pretty much all of that valley between the Euphrates and the Tigris, right? That's what, generally speaking, looking back, what geologists and whatnot call, or geographers call that area. But that's not what's really being talked about here. This is more the area that is in the upper part. So if you're familiar with that area and you're wondering where it is, it would be kind of beside where Assyria ended up coming from. Or it would be just to the north and the east of where Syria came from, still between the Tigris and Euphrates. Some geographers, historical geographers, think that perhaps it came down into Syria proper, but I don't think that I don't think that is the best take from what we do know linguistically and historically about the area. It would be up very close, in fact, to Haran, where Abraham settled for a while. When he left Ur, he went to Haran because his brother, it has the same name. I don't know if it was named after one another. I understand the Hebrew is a little different between one and the other, but that's the location. So that's where this king came from. So, I mean, he came a ways. I mean, he had to march all through Syria, down into, down into Bashan and the areas of the eastern settlements of the Jews, and then, into Israel proper. So he came from, there I see eastern Syria, perhaps a bit of Turkey and Iraq. And I know that looks weird for Turkey, but they changed their name a couple years ago, and that's the way it's spelled now. I guess they didn't want to be confused with the bird. But that's where it is. Now, he came, and to come that far, he had to have had a fairly large army. I mean, you can't, if you leave the places that you already run to go on a campaign, what's going to happen? If you leave the back door open, some ne'er-do-well is going to sneak in the back and steal you blind while you're out, on the front porch or whatever. So he must have had, a very strong military, very strong government, because to go as far as he did to get to where the Israelites was, that would have taken some effort. So that's him right there. Doesn't really tell us too much about the nature of what made his rule so bad. But it was bad enough to make the Israelites cry. He was pressing them, dominating them. So, I mean, was it too much taxes? Was he taking too much of their stuff? Was he, stealing their sons and daughters? I mean, we're not told, but it's obvious that there was an exertion of power that was unpleasant. And I guess that's about as much as we can say about that. Now, Othniel had good family lines. It's debatable, because there's a lot of uncertainty amongst scholars exactly what the family relationships in Caleb's family were, especially regarding this guy. But it appears that his uncle was Caleb. Now, Caleb was, a fantastic warrior. He was one like Joshua, who was willing to go in, despite the report of the spies, and wanted to go in. Said, "No, we can do it. God's with us." The other one said, "Come on, give it a rest." Something like that. Well, they all died. Caleb was preserved through the next 38 years of wanderings. And when he came in, you remember we saw that Judah was, always the one going up first. Well, I tell you what, he was the one who first established amongst the Judahites his realm around Hebron. I mean, he was just a man of faith. He was a man of faith and a man of action, and his bloodline, in a matter of speaking, leads to this guy. Now, what makes this guy a judge? Some of these items here. Keep in mind whenever we're talking about other judges. We can't say that it's exactly formulaic that this is what makes up a judge, because it's not mentioned in all of the accounts of the judges. But you do see it in some of the accounts of the judges, and it makes it seem like maybe there was a quality that was similar in all the judges, even if it's not mentioned overtly in the text. You got to figure that a judge who God is allowing to save Israel has got to have some kind of connection with God. Right? I mean, there's something there, even if it's not mentioned directly. So we do have it here in this very first judge, some cool things. It tells us that the Spirit of God was upon him, that God moved upon him. And, we, in our day and age, I think we would probably understand that in terms of that God was on him, he was anointed. The Spirit of God was on him. And because the Spirit of God was on him, the Spirit of God was with him, he was able to be inspired and be stirred and moved. And the things that he did were like informed, not just by his own thoughts, but, God was there. God was helping. God was leading. And so that's one of the things that made him a judge. The Spirit of God was upon him. And when the Spirit of God came upon him, what was the first thing that he did? Well, we don't know exactly the first thing that we did, but we know the thing that seemed to be the first thing that he did as a judge was rally Israel to rise up and fight. And so he led Israel into war, and he led them, against Cushan, this king of Mesopotamia. And I said, Aram. That's really what's there in Hebrew. So again, that's that area rather than down where the Sumerians came from, or down where the Babylonians were. Anyhow, he led them into war. Tells us, that as a matter, of course, right there, one of the statements that I read to you, that he led them into war, and he prevailed in war. So I guess it's possible to lead somebody in war and not prevail. That would probably make you not a judge. But if you lead them into war and you prevail in war, it certainly does make you a judge. But all the judges, in some respect, are going to be people that use violence to bring freedom from the affliction that Israel was under. All right? You read the Old Testament, sometimes, it's a bracing thing, because so often our New Testament concepts of God are all warm and fluffy, And I'm very happy that there's a loving warmth in God, that there's a loving kindness in him, and that he treats us with the gentleness that he does, that he is faithful like he is, and he's not quick to anger. I'm very appreciative of all the graces that God looks at us with. But at the same point in time, it's like, especially in the Old Testament, you really get a sense of God being a man of action, and the action is not necessarily gentle. He's not afraid to break a few eggs. He's going to make omelets. You've got to break some eggs if you're going to do that. And God certainly does not shrink back from that. Now that's also a lesson for us who are at the end of time, as we are now. For all of the touchy-feely, fluffy unicorns and rainbows kinds of things that we so often associate with God in the New Testament are going to find themselves totally incapable of describing the wrath that God will bring upon the earth. There's not going to be anything gentle about it. So, is God schizophrenic? No, he's always pure and holy and complete in what he does. And what he really can't stand is sin running amok. And as in times of old, as will always be the case with God, judgment is something to be feared. Right? But anyhow, he prevailed in war, and after the war, after the military victory, after the violence brought deliverance, then there was a space of peace. Now, in the case of Othniel, it says 40 years. Most of the judges will get some determination about how long they had rest after them. It's not. We won't have that on every judge, but we do have it on most of them. So it tells us when it is. Now, when did that happen? There's a lot of scholarly confusion about the timeline that's within Judges, mainly because there's really not a whole lot in the way of mile markers within the narratives. So, even something like building the temple. When Solomon was building the temple, you get a mile marker thrown in there, and it says that when they dedicated the temple, it was 480 years from when they left Egypt. Right, so you get some kind of a sense of scope of time and where things fit in with each other. And you really don't get that in Judges. And sometimes we'll see Judges where there's really nothing that really helps us to relate them one to another. And there's a thought, just amongst the scholars that deal with this kind of stuff that quite a few of them overlapped. They were judges during the same time. Maybe not in the same place, but at the same time during that span. So, here we have a pretty clear designation. That won't always be the case. I was able to place it to the 15th century, so that means sometime in the 1400s. If you accept a really early date for the Exodus, along the lines of what I proposed in the times past, just because of the lack of historical records, that would be very, very early in that century. And if you accept the more liberal scholarly consensus, I got nothing to say to you. You're totally out in the boonies. There's just no way in the world the Exodus happened in around 1260 BC. I mean, that's what you get amongst liberal scholars, right? I mean, they're trying to, I don't know, jam a square hole or a square peg into a round hole. It's a mess. It just only comes from unbelief. I think that if you look at the text, there's just no place to go. The Exodus happened someplace between, let's say, 1535 and 1445, and there's really no other place to go. That's it. So, someplace in the 15th century, because Othniel is amongst the first of the judges, and his work brought 40 years of peace. Now, that's it for Othniel. I mean, that's all that we can say about him. Kind of understand the pattern, kind of understand what was going on in this, specifically with him. Try to understand what made him a judge, because this is kind of like the prototype, and this is what judges are going to be like. God's going to raise them up. They're going to beat somebody up, and after they do, Israel's going to enjoy peace for a while. That's kind of the way it is. Let's go into judge number 2, Ehud. Now, Ehud is found immediately after Othniel, and so I want to read some of this. I don't know if I want to read all of it, but I'll read some of it. I'll read until my voice tells me to stop reading. Again, the Israelites, that is going to be a common phrase. Again, the Israelites, all through the Judges. I mean, because it's a repeating cycle, right? Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel. Getting the Ammonites and the Amalekites to join him, Eglon came and attacked Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. The Israelites were subject to Eglon of Moab for 18 years. So this is a little longer, right? 8, now we're up to 18. Again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and this is a common phrase, and he gave them a deliverer, Ehud, a left-handed man. That had to be stressed. It actually makes sense for the story. It's a detail that isn't just thrown out there because it's unusual. It is unusual, but it also has something to do with what happens in the story, so it kind of sets it up. He was a left-handed man, the son of Gera the Benjamite. Now the Israelites sent him with tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. So he had to be someone important even before he was the judge, right? Because they sent him with a tribute to their overlord. I don't think you do that. I don't think you just go out and pick anybody off the street to do that. That you pick somebody who is maybe trustworthy, someone who's noteworthy, someone who's important, that kind of a thing. So they sent the tribute with him. Now Ehud had made a double-edged sword about a cubit long. A cubit is about, I'm a small person, so it's longer than this to this, but it's about the fingertips to the elbow. So anywhere, depending on what realm you were in, anywhere between like 18 inches, 22 inches, something like that. Okay, so it's not a real long sword, long enough. So he strapped this double-edged sword to his right thigh under his clothing. Oh, it's concealed. It's a concealed weapon. Guess there was a problem with that even in that day. He presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was a very fat man. Gotta love that, right? No political correctness in the Bible. They went and fat-shamed Eglon, king of Moab. Boy, how rude. He was a very fat, and he just wasn't fat. He was very fat. This guy needed 3 or 4 seats in the airplane. Oh, they didn't have it.
Chariot.
A chariot. But anyhow, he was a very fat man. That's just funny. You know, you read something like that in the Bible and you're in the midst of the story and it's like what in the world's going on? Then you come to that. He was a very fat man. You start chuckling. Anyhow, after Ehud had presented the tribute, he sent on their way those who had carried it. But on reaching the stone images near Gilgal, he himself went back to Eglon and said, "Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you." The king said to his attendants, "Leave us," and they all left. Eglon, the very fat man, didn't think he had anything to fear from Eglon, or from Ehud. Ehud then approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room of his palace and said, "I have a message for God for you." And the king rose from his seat, and Ehud reached with his left hand and drew the sword from his right thigh. So that's why the left-handedness was important. And he plunged it into the king's belly. Even the handle sank in after the blade, and his bowels discharged. So he was so fat. Right? He has his sword that's about this long. Right? He's so fat. He stabs him in the gut and lets go of the blade, and it just all gets sucked into the fatness of the king. Wow. Maybe we ought not to put that in children's church videos, huh? Might not be appropriate for kids. Even the handle sank in after the blade, and his bowels discharged, and Ehud did not pull the sword out. Probably couldn't find it anymore if the handle went in, right? And the fat closed over it. Then Ehud went out to the porch. He shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked them. So he must have somehow or another locked it from the inside and then shut the doors. You know, it's like kids do when they, are visiting or whatnot, and they go to the bathroom and they lock the door, and then they leave and they had left it locked, and it's like, oh, no one's in there, but it's locked. After he had gone, the servants came and found the doors in the upper room locked. They said he must be relieving himself in the inner room of the palace. They thought he was doing, what sometimes we have to do. And they waited to the point of embarrassment. But when he did not open the doors of the room, they took out a key and unlocked them. See, now they did have a key. There they saw their Lord fallen to the floor, dead. You read this and it's like, who says the Bible is boring to read? I mean, you have this really fat guy, he gets stabbed in the belly with a sword. He's so fat it basically swallows up the blade, it disappears. He ends up, being disemboweled and all of this, and all his servants are out at the door, afraid to say anything because they might embarrass the king, and they're embarrassed because they're waiting so long now, they don't know what to do. I wonder how long they waited. What would be a long enough time to be embarrassed? I mean, this is an absolute king, so when do you speak up to say, are you done yet? I wouldn't want to be the first guy to speak up. While they waited, Ehud got away, and he passed by the stone images and escaped into Seirah. And when he arrived there, he blew a trumpet in the hill country, so this is a call to arms, of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hills, with him leading them. "Follow me," he ordered, "for the Lord has given Moab, your enemy, into your hands." And so they followed him down and took possession of the fords of the Jordan that led to Moab. And they allowed no one to cross over. And at that time they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all vigorous and strong, not one escaped. That day Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years. So, the comic details aside, there's the story. It's a little more involved, of course, than what we had with Othniel, but it's still, it fits in. It's a relatively short story that fits in with some of the modeling that we see. They were subject to 18 years of subjugation, but the peace that came after them was for 80 years. So you have more than twice as long they were subject to this guy, rather than under Othniel's judgeship. But their peace afterwards was twice as long as well. So that's pretty good. Now, who was Ehud? He was a son of Gera. We don't know really too much about that. A Benjamite. The only thing I can say about that is interesting is that is the tribe of Saul, the first king of Israel. So, that's an interesting connection. As far as Ehud himself, his methodology, what would you call it? Murderous? Conniving? It was treacherous, but it worked. And God raised him up to do it. God never apologizes for the vessels he uses to get his will done. And you see that particularly throughout Israelite history. Not everybody that God uses to bring about his judgment or to bring about his will as far as people rising, people falling. It often has nothing to do with how good a person is or what their character is like or whether they're doing something that is upright and clearly justified. Nothing like that. I mean, there's quite a few instances where you'll see like pretty shaky morals or pretty shaky actions being taken by people that God is using to do stuff, and you think, wow, man, it doesn't seem to get in the way of God getting done what needs to get done at all. And in the end, it has nothing to do with a person who God uses. It has everything to do with what God knows in his own mind will work. And that's an interesting thing to hold on to, especially when you read Romans chapter 9. Because in Romans chapter 9, you have the most misinterpreted passage in the entire Bible. And what is the scope of that? Well, it says in Romans chapter 9 that being used of God, being chosen by God to be used in time, has nothing at all to do whether someone is good or bad or anything else at all. It has to do with God's purpose in choosing that. So if God wants to get something done, he'll do it. Which makes me think that maybe an old pastor I knew maybe had the right idea when he was asked whether or not his church would take money that had been won in the lottery, because it was very clear back in those days that was gambling. We didn't do those kinds of things. That was evil. And his answer was insightful and maybe very biblical. He said, I'll take the devil's money and use it for God any day. And we have some of that in some of these stories. He did speak for God. We saw that. That's not always the case for the judges, but it certainly is for some of them. He led Israel in battle. That's pretty standard as well. Sometimes it's not direct battle. Sometimes, like when we get to the life of Samson was never really a general. I mean, he was an army in himself. That's pretty common. And they had peace for 80 years, which takes them into the 14th century. Any questions about Ehud? Yes?
That trait of being left-handed is not the only place where it said the tribe of Benjamin.
They were
one place had, I think, 200 that could use a sling with their left hand and a sword with their right in battle.
They say it's a genetic trait, so that's perfectly consistent. If this guy's noted and he's a Benjamite, he's left-handed, and other Benjamites are noted for that as well, right? Because left-handedness is found at a certain percentage of the population, but left-handers, if you are left-handed, you have a better shot at passing on left-handed or passing on that trait, because it is a genetic trait. I mean, it's like, something like having brown hair or blonde hair or things of that nature. Back in the day, it was so frowned upon in some circles that if you started using your left hand as a kid, you get smacked. There's still stories around today. People, were in kindergarten, they went to school, and, Someone didn't like them using their left hand, and a nun came over and gave them a whack. Use your right hand. So, but yeah, left-handedness is, thank you, Steve, that's a cool thought. All right, we'll look at Shamgar next. Now, Shamgar, we have one verse for Shamgar. That's it. That's all we have. Verse number 31. That's the only thing that's said about him. That's as far as the story goes. And so when we look at that story, I guess I may as well, since there's only one verse, I may as well read it, right? After Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. He too saved Israel. Now the interesting thing about him is that his name is possibly foreign. There's no etymology to his name. You often see in the history of the Israelites, names always seem to have, a direct meaning in language, but the experts have been looking at this for years and years and years, and we cannot find any relation to anything else in Hebrew for this name. So that means that if he's bearing a non-Israelite name, does that mean that maybe he's not Israelite? That's a possibility. Maybe that has something to do with why his story is so compressed. While it's not, he's not lingered upon, we don't really have a great attestation for, where he's, what he did and where he's from and how it happened and all that kind of stuff. It's just like a little cliff. That's all we get. Does that mean that maybe he was foreign? Possibly. The possibility exists. It says that he struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. Now, the language doesn't tell us that happened all at once. So, when we get to the stories of Samson, he wiped out a lot of people at one time. We don't have the language itself doesn't tell us that. It just tells us that he happened to kill this much. So, did he kill them in a day? Did he kill them in a month? Did he kill them over his lifetime? That we're just not told. We are told that his weapon of choice was an ox goad, which just basically a pointy stick. So that's speak softly and carry a big stick. Maybe, but he killed 600 Philistines. Now, the interesting thing about that is this probably, because we don't have any time reference to him, probably was something that did happen, maybe overlapping or in conjunction with Ehud. The thing about Ehud is that his actions took place on the eastern side. So he was at the Jordan in Moab. Those are things all on the eastern side. The Philistines were basically on the coast. So what's today? We have all these problems with Gaza now. That's the area north of that, a little south of that, a little east of that, not real far. That's where the Philistines were settled in. So maybe it's just that you have a regional thing going here, where Ehud was taking care of Eglon over on this side, where Eglon was coming from, whereas maybe this guy was doing something along similar at the same time, or maybe in some of those 40 years of peace, who knows. But we're not told that he did something that marked out his judgeship with so many years of peace or anything else like that. So, all of those kinds of things make me feel like, is it just because he's possibly foreign, perhaps, or is it just that he was doing something great, but he wasn't the actual judge of note? That's kind of what I wonder, what I think, is that maybe it was during Ehud's reign, and Ehud was the judge of note. This guy just was doing a work of saving Israel on the other side of the country, but without really the notoriety or the propriety of being a judge who was, actually being looked to in that kind of a way. Israel, we're not told they're crying out. That would make sense if this wasn't the beginning of it, but he was just doing something that was in the midst of what Ehud had done. And it's without any reference to any prophetic mission. So, we had We had with Othniel, it said that God, specifically raised him up. And with Ehud, we had him say to Eglon, I got a message from God for you. And then he said to the people, God is giving your enemy into your hands. Come and follow me. So you don't get that with this one. So all of those things kind of, you pack them all together, and it just kind of leads me to think that it is likely that he was parallel with Ehud and not as famous or not as noted and with not as much authority and without as much reach. Just, part of what was going on at that point in time. So there we have the Shamgar.